It is said that in the days when the wind still carried the scent of distant caravans across the plains of old Persia, Dervish Yunis was seen walking alone on a narrow road that led toward a forgotten city where the walls had long since surrendered their colors to time and dustes. And travelers once spoke of a bathhouse there that still breathed warmth as if the stones themselves remembered the bodies and voices that had passed through them. The old men of the road say that Yunis arrived without sound, as if he had been part of the wind before becoming visible, his cloak worn thin by journeys that no one could count, and his eyes carrying the quiet fatigue of a man who had listened too deeply to the world. It was in that city, between the silence of abandoned arches and the faint cries of distant merchants, that he heard for the first time of the keeper of the old bathhouse, a man who had remained longer than memory itself allowed tending to steam and stone, as though tending to an old wound that never fully closed. The bathhouse stood near a crumbling bazaar where spice sellers no longer came, and only the scent of damp stone lingered like a forgotten prayer. And yet every evening smoke would rise gently from its roof, suggesting that something within still lived. Yunis was drawn there not by curiosity alone, but by a heaviness in his chest that seemed to seek places where time slowed enough for sorrow to be understood rather than escaped. When he entered, the door groaned softly like an old man remembering speech, and inside he found the keeper sitting beside a basin of warm water, his hands roughened by years of steam and labor, his face neither young nor old, but marked by a stillness that made age irrelevant. The keeper did not ask who Yunis was, for in such places names were considered unnecessary burdens, and instead he simply gestured toward a wooden bench as if Yunis had always been expected. Steam curled through the air like slow-moving thoughts, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly like distant memory. It is said that the keeper spoke first not with questions but with observations, noting how travelers often arrive thinking they are seeking rest, when in truth they are seeking recognition of their own exhaustion, and Yunis, hearing this, lowered his gaze as though the words had already been waiting for him long before he arrived. The bathhouse was empty, except for them, yet it felt crowded with invisible presences, as if every man who had ever washed away the dust of his journey still lingered in the warmth of the stones. The keeper began to work slowly, pouring water over heated marble, and each sound carried the weight of a ritual repeated so many times that it had become indistinguishable from prayer. Yunis watched in silence, noticing how the man's movements contained neither haste nor hesitation, only acceptance, as though he had learned long ago that time does not need to be fought, only accompanied. Outside, the city remained half dead, its streets filled with the memory of footsteps rather than the footsteps themselves. And inside the bathhouse the air grew heavier with heat and scent, carrying something between comfort and melancholy. The keeper eventually spoke of the people who once filled the rooms with laughter, and complaint merchants who washed away dust before returning to their trade, young men who believed their bodies would always remain unmarked by time, and old men who came not to cleanse themselves but to remember what it felt like to be held by warmth. Yunis listened, feeling that each story was not spoken for him but for the walls, as if the bathhouse itself required remembrance to remain alive. There was a moment when silence deepened so completely that even the dripping water seemed to pause in thought, and in that silence Yunis felt a strange recognition, as though he too had once belonged to such a place long before his wandering began. The keeper, without looking at him, said softly that every traveler eventually arrives at a place where movement no longer answers the questions within him, and that such a place is not found on any map but in the quiet acceptance of one's own passing thoughts. Yunis did not respond, for there are moments when language feels too small to hold what is being revealed, and instead he watched the steam rise and dissolve, each curl vanishing before it could become anything permanent. The night outside deepened, and somewhere beyond the broken walls, a distant call to prayer rose and fell like a memory struggling to remain audible. And inside the bathhouse, the warmth seemed to gather around Yunis, not as comfort alone, but as a mirror reflecting everything he had carried without naming. The keeper finally handed him a small cloth and gestured toward the water, not as instruction but as invitation, and Yunis understood that nothing more would be said for now. For some teachings begin only in silence and in the act of washing away what the road has written upon the body and spirit alike. And so the wandering dervish, who had crossed cities and deserts without counting their names, lowered himself into the warm water as though entering not a bathhouse, but a memory that had been waiting patiently for his return. It is said that the water in the old bathhouse did not simply cleanse the body, but softened the edges of memory as if every drop carried within it the patience of centuries. And Dervish Yunis sat quietly in its warmth while the keeper moved around him like a shadow that had long forgotten the desire to be seen. The steam thickened between them, drifting upward in slow spirals that blurred the boundary between present and past. And Yunis found himself thinking not of where he was going next, but of how many unnamed places he had already left behind, without ever fully arriving in them. The keeper spoke again only after a long silence, his voice steady and worn like stone polished by countless hands, saying that a man who travels too long begins to mistake movement for understanding and understanding for peace, yet neither are guaranteed by distance. Yunis closed his eyes briefly, feeling the truth of those words settle not as instruction, but as recognition, like a door that had always been slightly open without him noticing. The keeper told him of a young bath attendant he once knew, a boy who believed that every traveler carried a secret worth discovering, and who listened to stories with such intensity that he forgot his own life was passing while others spoke of theirs. That boy, the keeper said, eventually left the bathhouse and never returned, not because he found what he sought, but because he realized that seeking itself can become a form of forgetting. The words hung in the warm air without urgency, and Yunis, listening, felt a quiet ache in his chest. Not sorrow exactly, but the recognition of how easily human longing reshapes itself into direction. Outside, a faint wind passed through the broken arches of the city, carrying dust against stone like the slow turning of pages in a book. No one was reading anymore, and inside the bathhouse the sound of water being poured became almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat that belonged not to a single body, but to the place itself. Yunis noticed the keeper's hands more closely, now the way they carried memory in their motion. As if each gesture had been repeated so many times, it no longer needed thought, and yet within that repetition, there was a kind of devotion that did not ask for meaning. The keeper said that people often come to such places believing they are shedding dirt, but what they truly shed is the illusion that they have ever been separate from the world that touched them. Yunis opened his eyes at that, looking at the tiled walls where faint traces of earlier steam had left patterns like forgotten writing. And for a moment he wondered how many lives had dissolved into those surfaces without leaving names behind. The keeper then asked him, not as interrogation but as passing curiosity, how long it had been since he last stayed in one place long enough to hear the same morning twice, and Yunis could not answer, for he realized that he no longer measured time by mornings but by departures. There was a basin near them filled with water so still it reflected the ceiling like a second world turned upside down, and Yunis watched it as though it might reveal something about his own reflection that mirrors alone could not show. The keeper continued speaking softly, saying that the bathhouse had once been part of a larger city life, when laughter would spill through its doors and merchants argued about prices while waiting for steam to loosen the dust from their skin, but now only memory kept it alive. And memory, he added, is a fragile worker that grows tired when left alone for too long. Yunis felt a subtle heaviness in that thought, as if he too had been maintained only by the memories of others, without realizing it, sustained by stories told after his passing rather than his presence itself. A faint scent of herbs lingered in the air, perhaps from oils once used on travelers, and it carried with it an almost imperceptible sweetness that contrasted with the aged stone and quiet melancholy of the place. The keeper finally sat beside him, not as master and guest, but as two men briefly sharing the same silence, and in that silence Yunis understood that there are encounters that do not change the direction of a life but deepen the awareness of its weight. The bathhouse seemed to breathe around them, its warmth steady and enduring, and Yunis, without speaking, felt the long road within him soften for a moment, as if the act of simply being still had opened a space where exhaustion could rest without explanation. The keeper then said almost to himself, that water remembers everything it touches but reveals nothing unless it is still. And Yunis thought of all the rivers he had crossed without ever asking what they had carried before meeting his feet. Outside, the city had begun to fade into night, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed briefly along the empty streets, like reminders of a life that no longer gathered in one place. And within the bathhouse the steam continued to rise, carrying with it the unspoken agreement that nothing here needed to be resolved, only witnessed. And so Yunis remained, neither arriving nor departing, but existing in a quiet threshold where the keeper's words settled into him like warmth that would not leave immediately when the water cooled. It is said that the night deepened fully over the forgotten city, while Dervish Yunis remained within the old bathhouse where the steam had now grown thinner, as if even warmth itself knew when to begin departing, and the keeper moved more slowly, like a man who has learned that every motion eventually returns to stillness whether one resists it or not. The silence between them had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of introduction or observation, but the quieter silence of understanding that does not require confirmation. Yunis sat with his hands resting in the warm water, watching faint ripples disappear before they could become patterns. And he felt something within him loosen, not dramatically, but like a knot that had been holding itself together for too long, finally accepting that it could remain untied. The keeper rose and walked toward the corner where old stone shelves held simple vessels, and as he passed, the sound of his footsteps on wet ground echoed softly like distant memory repeating itself for no one in particular. He spoke then without turning, saying that every bathhouse is a place where the body remembers what the mind refuses to carry, and that travelers often believe they are washing away dust, when in truth they are meeting themselves without the protection of motion. Yunis listened, feeling the words not as guidance but as something already lived, something he had been circling for years without knowing its center. Outside, a faint wind moved through the broken city gates, carrying the scent of dry earth and old stone, and it sounded almost like breathing through empty corridors. The keeper returned and placed a folded cloth beside Yunis, not as an offering of departure, but as acknowledgement that all stays eventually become departures, even before the body moves. He then said more quietly that he had seen many men pass through those waters, some laughing, some grieving, some silent as Yunis. But the bathhouse never kept any of them. It only remembered the shape of what they released. Yunis finally spoke, then his voice low and measured, asking whether the keeper himself had ever wished to leave. And the keeper paused for a long moment, as if considering whether the question belonged to this moment or to another life. He answered that leaving and staying are often the same act, seen from different sides, and that he had long ago stopped choosing between them because time itself had chosen for him. In that answer Yunis felt a strange clarity, not bright or sudden, but steady like the glow of an oil lamp that has burned long enough to accept its own endurance as purpose. The water around him had begun to cool slightly, and he noticed how warmth like memory does not vanish at once but withdraws gradually, leaving behind a softness that is almost indistinguishable from absence. The keeper then turned and looked at him directly for the first time with a gaze neither heavy nor light, but composed of simple recognition, and said that Yunis would leave soon, not because he had been told to leave, but because travelers always recognize the moment when staying no longer teaches anything new. Yunis did not argue, for he understood that this was not instruction but observation shaped by long experience. He rose slowly from the water, feeling the air against his skin like a second form of silence, and the keeper handed him his worn cloak, now softened by steam and time. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, and in that moment the bathhouse seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the end of another passing. Yunis wrapped the cloak around himself and stepped toward the door, and with each step he felt not lighter, but more aware of what he carried. At the threshold, he stopped and turned slightly as if to ask something that words could not properly form, but the keeper only nodded once, a gesture so small it felt like it belonged more to understanding than to farewell. It is said that Yunis left the bathhouse just as the first hint of dawn touched the broken rooftops of the city, and the steam behind him faded into the morning air as though it had never gathered at all. As he walked away along the empty road, the world appeared unchanged. Yet something in his pace had softened, no longer driven by the urgency of arrival or departure, but by a quieter awareness that every step is already part of what it seeks. The old men of nearby villages would later say that a wandering dervish passed through their roads that morning, not speaking to anyone, yet somehow leaving behind the feeling that silence itself had briefly been understood. And it is said that the keeper of the bathhouse remained where he was, continuing his slow work among stone and steam, not waiting for Yunis, nor for anyone else, but simply tending to what remains when people pass through themselves without noticing, while the city continued its quiet forgetting around him like a long patient breath.